Never for a moment have I regretted that I forgetfully reincarnated myself as the child of Lawrence Wilson Watts and Emily Mary Buchan at Rowan Tree Cottage in Holbrook Lane, in the village of Chislehurst, Kent, England, almost due south of Greenwich, on the morning of January the 6th, 1915, at about 20 minutes after 6. With the sun in Capricorn, conjuncted with Mars and Mercury, and in trine to a moon in Virgo, with Sagittarius rising. In going back over one's past, one remembers all too much foolishness. Yet, how can I forgive anyone else if I don't forgive myself? And how can I believe that now, as I have become and matured, I'm no longer a fool? Basically, my own laughter at myself has something to do with the incongruity of such a clown being God in disguise, of the big act called Alan Watts being a manifestation of the infinite energy of the universe. As I witness the universe getting away with me, I wonder what other uproarious deceptions it will perpetrate. I am a mystic in spite of myself, remaining as much of an irreducible rascal as I am, as a standing example of God's continuing compassion for sinners, or, if you will, of Buddha nature in a dog, or of light shining in darkness. Come to think of it, in what else could it shine? Since the age of 42, I have been a freelance, a rolling stone, and a shaman, as distinct from a priest. For the shaman gets his magic alone in the mountains and forests, whereas a priest gets his from being ordained by a guru or bishop. The first, the shaman that is, goes with the culture of nomads and hunters, and the second with cultures of agrarians or industrialists. Although I am unofficially and on the side an ordained priest of the Anglican Communion, my genes must have come from the nomads of Europe, and my reincarnation from the Taoist poets of China, or the Yamabushi or mountain hermits of Japan. I'm gregarious, but I like to be left alone. My existence is a coincidence of opposites. On the one hand, I'm a shameless egotist. I like to talk, entertain, and hold the center of the stage. On the other, I realize quite clearly that the ego named Alan Watts is an illusion, a social institution, a fabrication of words and symbols without the slightest substantial reality. Nevertheless, I know too that this temporary pattern, this process, is a function, a doing, a karma, in just the same way as the sun, the galaxy, or shall we be bold to say Jesus Christ or Gautama the Buddha? How can I say this without offense, without seeming proud, haughty, and pretentious? I simply and even humbly know that I am the Eternal. Yet, the idea of my coming on as a Messiah or great Guru just breaks me up with laughter. Because, at the same time, I am an unrepentant sensualist. I am an immoderate lover of women and the delights of sexuality, of the greatest French, Chinese, and Japanese cuisine, of wines and spirituous drinks, of smoking cigars and pipes, of gardens, forests, and oceans, of jewels and paintings, of colorful clothes, and of finely bound and printed books. I have also an attraction to being a no-strings-attached Taoist wanderer in the mountains, cloud-hidden, whereabouts unknown. And when the mood suits me, I also like to practice Buddhist meditation in the Zen or Tibetan Dzogchen style, which is simply sitting quietly or walking rhythmically without thoughts or verbalizations in your head. Walking meditation I have always preferred to long periods of sitting, for one reason. When walking, there is no need for others to know that you are meditating and thus to feel guilty or embarrassed for not doing likewise. For another, the self-consciousness of sitting in a special way, of having a special time or place for the practice, does not obtrude itself. Thus, I could go out for a walk under the pretext of taking the air or pace the floor, seeming to be thinking out a book, and yet be absorbed in mystical silence of the mind. And oddly enough, at the same time, it didn't really occur to me that I was practicing meditation, so that I've always considered myself rather lazy and haphazard in respect of this discipline. I didn't think of myself as doing an exercise, but simply as exploring a state of consciousness out of sheer interest. A Christian writer has said that the monk prays best who does not know that he is praying. I see religion as I see such other basic fascinations as art and science, in which there is room for many different approaches, styles, techniques, and opinions. Thus, I am not formally a committed member of any creed or sect, and hold no particular religious view or doctrine as absolute. I deplore missionary zeal and consider exclusive dedication to and advocacy of any particular religion as either the best or the only true way, an almost irreligious arrogance. Yet, my work and my life are fully concerned with religion, and the mystery of being is my supreme fascination. If I'm asked to define my personal tastes in religion, I must say that they lie between Mahayana Buddhism and Taoism, with a certain leaning towards Vedanta and Catholicism, or rather, the Orthodox Church of Eastern Europe. The Russian cathedral in Paris is, for me, one of the most joyous shrines in the world. But I am still more at home in the serene and non-militant atmosphere of such Buddhist sanctuaries as Koyasan and Chionin, where the deep and sonorous chant is measured by the easy pulse of a wooden drum, where pines and maples stand beyond the open screens, and the smoke of aloes wood, incense, hangs in the air. When I was about 17, I was still reading Suzuki on Zen and trying to practice some form of Buddhist yoga, Zazen or Satipatthana, and simply couldn't make up my mind which specific method to follow or exactly what state of consciousness was Satori, Samadhi, Moksha, or true enlightenment. I had no spiritual master. I was a shaman on my own, in a religious jungle. When at Canterbury in England I had become the head boy of my house, I had the privilege of going off by myself to study and meditate in an ancient Elizabethan room, where one could light a fire and stay up until late at night. It was in the autumn of 1932, windy, with fallen leaves skittering along the roads and fields. And I was trying desperately to work out this problem. What is the experience which these Oriental masters are talking about? The different ideas of it which I had in mind seemed to be approaching me like little dogs wanting to be petted, and suddenly I shouted at all of them to go away. I annihilated and bawled out every theory and concept of what should be my properly spiritual state of mind, or of what should be meant by me. And instantly my weight vanished. I owned nothing. All hang-ups disappeared. I walked on air. And thereupon I composed a haiku, all forgotten and set aside, wind scattering leaves over the fields. And one evening, when Eleanor, my first wife, and I were walking home from a meditation session at the Buddhist Society, I began to discuss the method of concentration on the eternal present. Whereupon she said, "Why try to concentrate on it? What else is there to be aware of? Your memories are all in the present just as much as the trees over there. Your thoughts about the future are also in the present. The present is just a constant flow, like the Tao, and there's simply no way of getting out of it." With that remark, my whole sense of weight vanished. You could have knocked me down with a feather. I realized that when the Hindus said Tattvamasi, you are that, they meant just what they said. For a whole week thereafter, I simply floated, remembering my friend Professor Spiegelberg's telling me of the 6 precepts of the Tibetan master Tilopa. No thought, no reflection, no analysis, no cultivation, no intention. Let it settle itself. Now, this was doubtless a premature satori, for I was unable to resist the temptation to write, think, and intellectualize about it. Yet when I'm in my right mind, I still know that this is the true way of life, at least for me. Conscious thought, reflection, analysis, cultivation, and intention are simply using the mind's radar or scanning beam for purposes which the mind as a whole can do of itself and of its own with far more intelligence and less effort. So, from the beginning, I was never interested in being good at Zen in the sense of mastering a traditional discipline, as for example, in studying the piano with Schnabel, to the point where my recordings of the Beethoven sonatas would be indistinguishable from his. I had already done that kind of thing. And the point here is not to boast, but to explain the real nature of my interest in Zen. For I had, without any formal teacher, unquestionably mastered the art of public speaking, and in the church had become as expert a liturgist as anyone. What I was after was therefore not so much discipline as understanding. And so far as I was concerned, the formal study of Zen was a kind of busy behavior, to sit hour after hour and day after day with aching legs, to unravel Hakuin's tricky system of dealing with koan, to subsist on tea, pickles, and brown rice, or to master Dogen's ritual style of life was, although as good in its own way as learning to sail, not what I needed to know. What I saw in Zen was an intuitive way of understanding the sense of life by getting rid of silly quests and questions. The archetypal situation was when Huike asked Bodhidharma how to attain peace of mind. Bodhidharma said, "Bring your mind out and I will pacify it." "But when I look for it," said Huike, "I can't find it." "In that case," the master concluded, "it's pacified already." Isn't that crazy? It is thus that almost every morning when I first awaken, I have a feeling of total clarity as to the sense of life. A feeling of myself and the universe as a matter of the utmost simplicity. I and that which is are the same. Always have been, always will be. There's simply nothing special to be achieved, realized, or performed. The sound of a frog jumping into an old pond is plop, in Japanese, mizu no oto. This plop isn't physical, material, mental, or spiritual. For plop isn't a philosophical category. Plop is just plop. This is the simplest thing in the world, but the hardest to explain. If you understand it, you can see that this plop is all of a piece with 1,000 galaxies.
This is WBAI in New York. You're listening to In the Spirit, and Alan Watts is with us and has been reading from his own autobiography, in his own way. He's reading in his own way from his own, which Pantheon Books has just published. Well, Alan, what do you think of your autobiography?
Well, it was a very difficult thing for me to write, and I wrote it at the insistence of my editor, Paula Maguire at Pantheon, and my wife. I said, you know, what should I be doing writing an autobiography? I haven't been a man of adventure. I have achieved no great deeds in life. I have not become extremely wealthy. I have not been an explorer or a great warrior or an adventurer. I've been a rather sedentary character because I was brought up really to be a Brahmin, an intellectual, and so I thought, I can't write a thing like that. But they went on insisting, and so I put myself to it, and it took me 2 years. I wasn't used to writing the narrative style. I was used to writing philosophy, and that's as easy as falling off a log. But writing narrative, I always admired novelists, you see, because of their gift of the portrayal of human character and of telling stories. And I got sucked into it. Slowly, slowly, slowly. It was very hard.
Do you consider yourself an intellectual, or
yes?
So there's nothing terrible about that term in your vocabulary.
No, not at all. I think that although some people think that my position is anti-intellectual, they don't understand that to be effective intellectually, you have to interpose thinking with intervals of mental silence, when you stop thinking altogether. Because after all, if I don't stop talking, I can't hear what you have to say. And then thinking, in my definition, is talking to oneself or figuring to oneself in one's skull. And if you don't occasionally stop that activity, you don't have anything to think about except thoughts. So you get unrelated to the real universe.
A couple of your students, you might say, began a thing called Esalen, which is familiar to a lot of us.
They were students not only of me. This must be emphasized. Michael Murphy and Dick Price, who really started Esalen, were also students of Frederick Spiegelberg, and Michael of Sri Aurobindo. And the confluence of us all together inspired them to start this thing.
Do you think that growth centers like Esalen, do you think that they may be truly anti-intellectual in a certain way? I mean, do you think they may be sensitivity training, may be a training of the emotions and the openness of the emotions, and perhaps leave out intellectual?
No. The thing is absolutely fascinating what's happening. Esalen has very scrupulously avoided taking a partisan point of view to any one discipline. Although they've had very powerful people there, like the late Fritz Perls, who could have dominated the whole scene. But that never happened. Now, they are equally interested in the strictly intellectual life. For example, next March, the great British mathematician, philosopher Spencer Brown, author of Laws of Form, is coming, and he's going to give a seminar there for 10 days for a select group of some of the finest intellects in the United States. And they support that as much as they do sensitivity training and so on.
So you think they're combining?
Yes, I mean these places are the new universities. The university itself has become practically obsolete. It's a machine shop for turning out.
And there are now hundreds of these growth centers.
There are over 100 in North America.
Do you think they'll replace the university, or will there be a place for a straight university?
There will be a place for a straight university. There has to be, because people need certain kinds of technical training, which they can only get there. But I hate to say this in a democracy, but the intellectual elite will eventually emerge from the growth centers.
It's not possible they could combine the two kinds of training.
Well, the universities are interested. There's no doubt. I mean, let's not put them down too far. Life is not a black and white situation, and we have some very great universities and great scholars.
But what about the other great social institution, at least it used to be, the church? Will these growth centers replace the church?
Tricky. I don't know. They are stimulating the church. Let's put it that way. See, the problem with the church and the synagogue is that they're too talkative. You go to church on Sunday and they lecture God on what he's supposed to do as if he didn't know. Then they lecture the people on what they should do as if they could or would. And it's incessant chatter. And I'm trying to persuade the church to cultivate mental silence. And I'm having some success, funnily enough, because the church is desperate. If no other reason than it's desperate financially.
Well, then, really, you mentioned what I consider the house number when you said silence.
Yes.
And the cultivation of silence. You are an admirer of Krishnamurti. He's one of the people you speak most highly of in your autobiography. And he, of course, is an advocate of mental silence completely. But he also says, in many ways and in many places, that one shouldn't cultivate it. It can't be cultivated.
It can't be cultivated.
So how are we to proceed from here?
First of all, if you try to cultivate it and find out that you can't stop the internal turbulence in your mind, what is called in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra the Chitta Vritti. He defines yoga, which means union or integration of yourself with the universe. He says yogas chitta vritti nirodha. That means yoga is the cessation of babble in the mind. Now, you can't stop it, no matter what you do. But if you realize that you can't stop it, you get the message, which is that you don't exist. That's why you can't stop it. That your ego is nothing more than a concept. It's an abstraction like the equator. And nobody will trip over the equator. So your ego is your concept of yourself. And so that concept cannot stop the babble in the mind. Now, as soon as you realize that, the babble stops of itself. as when you simply listen to pure sound. See, that's essentially the method of yoga. It's called mantra.
Krishnamurti, of course, wouldn't identify it as
Yes,
yoga.
but he always starts out every talk by saying it is extremely important to listen. Will you please listen? And he's trying to say, listen to the sound of my voice rather than any instructions I have to give you. Please participate in the real world. Listen, 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 and you will discover, if you truly listen, that the listening, the sound and the listener are the same process. There isn't a dichotomy of I listening on the one hand and the sound being listened to on the other. The Krishnamurti has a terrible time explaining what he means. He's worked at it for years and years and years and published volumes of talks and so on. And I know what he's talking about. And I'm trying to say the same thing in a slightly different style. See, I think Krishnamurti is too serious. He doesn't allow laughter at his lectures. But I love him. I think he's a great man. I always allow laughter at my lectures. We get into an uproar because there's a great Zen master in this country by the name of Joshu Sasaki. And he recommends for a method of meditation that every morning you stand up, put your hands on your hips with the wrists upwards and roar with laughter for 5 minutes. And imagine if Mr. Nixon did that. Imagine if the Queen of England or Mr. Heath did that, or Mr. Kosygin, or the Emperor of Japan, or Mao Zedong. And then when you think about that, you laugh all over again.
So maybe you can't talk directly about silence. You have to do things like laugh or...
Right.
Or
yes, you have to get into non-verbal experience. Because the real world is non-verbal.
But do you still maintain that there's some value in traditional religious forms and practices? I mean, Krishnamurti throws them all out and said, but I sense with you some sort of, whether it's nostalgia or what, some sort of feeling that...
I wouldn't throw them out. I would understand them in a slightly different way, though, from the way in which they are generally understood. In other words, when I go to church, I don't expect by attending Mass that I will get some advantage from the power of God, that he will do something special for me, like get me an increase in salary. I don't even listen to the prayers. I listen to the sound of the priest's voice. That's why the Roman Catholic Church made a serious mistake in having the Mass said in the vernacular. They should have kept it in Latin. I was brought up in England, as has been indicated, and we boys were subjected to the most amazing religion of lecturing God. Almighty and most merciful God, King of kings and Lord of lords, the only ruler of princes, who dost from thy throne behold all dwellers upon earth, most heartily we beseech thee from thy throne to behold our most gracious sovereign King George the King.
That's good.
And all the royal family, endue them plenteously with heavenly gifts, health and wealth, long to live. When all this is the language of court flattery. Because God was idolized, conceived in the image of a cosmic monarch.
Well, why is it that you went into the church at a certain point in your life for 5 years?
As an absolutely knowing subversive. But it although it worked in a way, but I couldn't sustain the role of a clergyman in those days. Today it's different, but in those days I was much too much of a bohemian to wear the Roman collar and the black suit and come on like I was holier than thou. It just didn't work.
In the Zen idea of nothing special, you mentioned that Suzuki sometimes would assign his letters no special person.
Bujinin.
Seems to be the finest antidote to the holier than thou.
Oh yes.
Do you feel that way about yourself? Do you feel that you're nothing special?
Oh, I do it in a slightly different way than Suzuki.
I thought so.
Everybody knows, it's a matter of public knowledge, that I'm a rascal. That I drink too much, that I sleep with too many women, that even people go so far as to say that I'm trying to commit suicide. Because Americans are terribly serious. They don't understand certain things that are understood in Europe and Asia about the joyous life. They are always wanting that everything you do is supposed to be good for you. Now, life is bad for you. As Jung pointed out, he was joking. He said life is a disease with a very bad prognosis. It lingers on for years and invariably ends with death. And, you know, everybody, mental health, everybody is after you for your best interests. And I'm sick of being pursued for my best interests.
Since there's no you anyway to have these interests.
Sure, right. But everybody's concerned. Everybody is worried about one's health, one's mortality. Because, you see, the fallacy is this, that you must understand, if you're going to survive elegantly, you must not feel a compulsion to survive. Confucius put it very well: a man who understands the Tao, that is the course of nature, in the morning, can die with content in the evening. And so when anyone has a compulsion to survive, we say, well, I've got to go on living because I'm responsible. I have all these children to support. But thereby, by taking that attitude, I teach my children the same attitude. And they go on compulsively surviving for their children. And everybody lives life as a drag. So, if we would realize that we really don't have to go on living, there is actually no reason why we should continue. We're not under orders.
Well, have you already gone away, so to speak? I mean, presumably, if there's no individual ego and one sees it clearly, one has died.
Well, if you ask me, have I gone away? You see, that's a somewhat paradoxical question. Because then I would be claiming credit for being an egoistic non-ego. You know,
so it's hard to
yes, it's hard
let
to
on
put it
to
into
yourself.
our language because we've got a language constructed in such a way that it's a perpetual trap, and you can't say these things.
But presumably, you can carry on a full articulated life without thinking that it's a you or
Yes. Oh, of course you can. And it's much more fun than the other kind of life. And
it's like sitting in on a course, not for credit. I find
that's right. Now, that's a very good comparison. Yes.
I feel very often I'm not taking life for credit.
That's right. That's a very good comparison. Yes.
What about this California dreaming that you do? I mean, in your book, California takes on proportions, almost mythic proportions in a way. Big Sur and the people there, and the fact that you find that in that geographical location, you've found something right for you, a kind of a final place.
Yes. Because it's an extremely dangerous place to live as a result of the combination of the San Andreas Fault and the Governor Reagan. But it's the most beautiful place in that it is the American version of the Riviera. I couldn't make my living if I lived in Mentone or Aires, because I can't make a living at my profession in any country except the United States. And therefore, California is the nearest thing to that southwestern sunlight landscape that I always sought from boyhood. And
I'm from California myself, and I feel a kind of nostalgia, but I wonder whether it's just nostalgia sometimes, or whether there's something, whether there's a kind of a holy land going on there somehow.
oh, there is.
Mm.
It's one of the most stimulating spiritual and intellectual climates that there is.
I'd say equaled only by New York City.
Yes, I mean, here, naturally, there is also a tremendous gathering of fascinating people.
But there's a nature seems to be more in
Nature
tune
is
with
more
it.
benign.
Yeah.
New York City has a rather tough climate, that's why. Also, it's too industrialized.
I wanted to ask you a couple of things that people might just want to ask, because it's topmost in their minds. In your book, you said, finally, your final feeling about LSD, roughly speaking, is that when you get the message, you hang up the phone. Is that about
Yes,
where you stand?
yes.
on that?
I mean, I would say that from my own personal point of view, if all the LSD in the world were to vanish tomorrow, I wouldn't regret it, because I think I've learned everything from that kind of experience that it has to teach.
Do you think that a whole generation of people now have done the learning for the society? Do you suppose that certain people can completely bypass the LSD experience, building on the experience of others, or do you think it's good for everyone to get lost in the woods?
That's a difficult question to answer. I don't really know the answer to that. LSD was a valuable catalyst in showing people that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy, to quote Hamlet. Dangerous, and all the more dangerous when suppressed, and when one couldn't be sure that the LSD you were getting was the real thing.
Yeah, prohibition is absolutely no good. There's no question of that.
I can't understand American prohibitionism because it corrupts the police by asking them to be armed clergymen.
But it seems to me that, as opposed to the early '60s and the '50s, that there are a lot of people in the society today who are deeply into their consciousness through meditative techniques of one kind or another.
Yes.
And there's also a fashion tending in that direction. In other words, people are aware of it. It's not an outrageous thing.
Don't put it down by calling it a fashion.
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
In fact, could I ask you, do you think there is some sort of new age of spirit dawning, or do you think, or
whether it's a new age, that may be too pompous a phrase to use, but there most decidedly is a colossal, I would call it spiritual awakening occurring in this country. It's as alive as all get out.
Is it, do you think it's indigenous? I mean, really indigenous, or is it sustained by people coming from the East and Japan?
It's both. It's a result of global intercommunication. We're in a situation now where, by means of technological transportation and by telephonic and television and electronic communication, we've got one world. We can't help it. And therefore, all the cultures of the world are merging. And this stimulates every culture.
You mentioned, again, I'm quoting you roughly, you feel that psychotherapy is largely a bore, except for most Jungians who you would accept them. Do you think that that spiritual life in the largest sense will begin to replace psychotherapy?
Well, the psychotherapists themselves are undergoing a great deal of evolution. We have, for example, the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, where the most extraordinary, interesting material is being published. And I know all sorts of people in the field of psychotherapy who are no longer, what shall I call it? Who are no longer preoccupied with what I've always felt to be a very shallow view of the good life. Of,
Well, do you think that...
Are you in touch with reality when reality is considered as the world seen on a bleak Monday morning? Where reality is a trip from the maternity ward to the crematorium. You know, that kind of thing, where they ask you to test your sanity. What are 9 and 7?
I don't know.
Well, heaven's sakes, but that's it. Or are you in a fit condition to drive a car? That's become a test of sanity, you see. And it's terrible.
Well, do you think that perhaps like universities, which evolve and become turned on, that psychotherapy can do the same thing, and there could be a
Oh yes.
So there's a place for both of them in the society.
Indeed there is. There are, I mean, let me not, again, I want to repeat this, not put the university as an institution down, because marvelous things are now happening in our universities. I am astonished at the response I can get from universities in the terms of enormous audiences for lectures on the Chinese theory of nature, some very far out subject of that kind.
So it sounds like the structures of society are hanging in there. They're going to persist, and perhaps they're okay and growing.
But what we've got going wrong is we've got a kind of bifurcation. You take your classified telephone directory and open up churches and have a ruler in your hand, and you will find that the longest space is occupied by authoritarian Bible-banging churches. And these people are barbarians who take the written word of the Bible literally, because they need terribly, they have a personal need for something to depend on.
Do you think the same kind of barbarianism of the spirit is represented in our government? I mean, do you think
the
government,
you see, realizes that there is a very large number of people like that, and therefore, to keep their votes, they have to pander to those kind of people. And these are the boys who never grew up. They always need Papa.
Well, what's the possibility for what's going to be the outcome of these two different trends, this kind of in the society? Do you think that?
Well, the trouble is that the boys who always need Papa are violent. They have the guns, and they're the types of people who like to be soldiers, policemen, tough guys, and therefore they have a great deal of power. Although I must say, recently I had a long talk with the General of the Army, who was a Virginian gentleman who was extremely intelligent, and I was quite shocked to find out how wise he was. And I've even been invited by the Air Force to lecture at the great Air Force Academy.
You mean there's a Buddha nature in a general?
Oh yes. I've lectured at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, and also at the Air Force Weapons Research Institute in Albuquerque. And some of those officers are brilliant men, but somehow something's wrong with their strategy. They don't know where they want to go.
I have to say, this is WBAI in New York, and maybe that's a good time to ask, considering the listenership of BAI and their own political standpoint, do you think would you be accused of being a counter-revolutionary?
I'm apolitical, actually, although I'm tremendously interested in certain specific political problems. I can't buy any party or ideology. I'm not sure whether the right wing or the left wing is a greater threat to my freedom.
Can a person practice non-ego and silence and still be engaged in political life? Say?
Oh yes, definitely. In other words, you can't be effectively engaged in political life unless you do practice mental silence. Gary Snyder puts it very well. He says you can't work well for ecological causes unless you realize in the first place that it's not necessary to do anything about it. But if you realize that in the first place, that in other words the universe is automatically harmonious, if you understand that, that gives you tremendous energy to do all sorts of things.
And Gary got highest praise in your book. I mean,
Yes.
You said that you wished you could claim him as your
Disciple.
spiritual successor.
Yeah, right.
Yet nonetheless, he seems to be immersed in a more traditional Zen and more traditional practice than you. Is it true?
Not entirely. No. He is. He's done all that, but he takes it with a light heart. He doesn't come on stuffy about it.
Didn't take it for credit.
No, he didn't take it for credit.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In your book, and in general, it seems that you have a kind of non-interest in the occult and the psychic phenomena.
Yeah.
Is that the Zen background?
Yes.
That makes you that way? You
Somewhat. Yes. Zen people are not interested in that.
Well, what about the idea that various Hindu practices take the consciousness into higher chakras, whereas the Zen practice keeps it in the hara, and that might account to some extent for the difference, because Indian spirituality is really very far out in comparison to Zen.
So yes and no. I mean, some of the people I know who are well into Hindu practice, Baba Ramdas, formerly Richard Alpert, Bhagavan Das, Swami Sachidananda, I find extremely companionable.
And they don't seem to be too concerned with the psychic
they
sphere.
don't spook you with miracles and all that kind of.
So maybe being down to earth then is a characteristic of any sort of spiritual
Yes,
person.
because you realize that what we call Earth is not away from it. Tattvamasi, you're in right now. Earth is it. And I find these people, the contemporary bunch of what I'd call bhakti yogins, very enjoyable. But the only thing I'm critical of is their attitude about celibacy. They don't all have it. Because I think a person who goes for celibacy, by not exercising his sexual functions, tends to become cruel. And that we need to exercise those functions just as we need vitamins and exercise and breathing and all that kind of thing.
But sometimes exercising the sexual functions doesn't guarantee that one will be compassionate.
No, it doesn't
bodhisattva.
guarantee anything. But I do think that if you don't do it, you tend to become uptight.
Is that a generality? Would you make certain exceptions? I mean, for instance, you mentioned a humorous episode with having tea with Swami Prabhavananda in California.
Well,
I mean, obviously he's not cruel. I mean, maybe some other effects have occurred through lifelong celibacy.
I don't want to speak of Swami Prabhavananda
No,
personally.
But cases like that.
But
Thomas Merton or something like this. I mean, there have been celibates.
There are people. I have several friends who don't really seem to have any strong sexuality.
I see.
Just like some people aren't really interested in food. These are very rare people. but I only object when they try to impose their ideas on everybody else.
And if someone is interested in food, why restrain it and
Yeah,
torture it?
sure.
I see that. Well, suppose you were to say, something I consider this sort of the two foci of your position, that if it can be called a position, that there is no ego, therefore everything is attained. I mean, the beatitude is now.
Yes.
Now, can someone hear that instantly and be enlightened?
Sometimes, yes. For most people, you see, it needs some explanation. That what we call the ego is a combination of two factors. On the one hand, it's your opinion of yourself, your image of yourself, your idea of yourself, which has been brainwashed into you since you were a baby. This corresponds, on the other hand, to a certain sensation. And this sensation is one of chronic muscular strain, which we were taught when, in the beginning, Mama said, "Darling, try to go to sleep." Or the teacher said, "Pay attention. Take a careful look at this. Now listen carefully." And one does a muscular tension in order to achieve a neurological result. And this tension is useless. It's like when you're taking off on a jet plane and you think you've gone too far down the runway and the damn thing ought to be up in the air. You start pulling at your seatbelt. Now, there's a chronic strain in everybody's muscles. It may be sometimes located between the eyes, sometimes in the heart center, sometimes in the solar plexus, and sometimes in the rectum. And it's holding together. Now, you say, pull yourself together. Now, that is a completely useless muscular effort to attain a neurological result. But that is chronic, and it becomes associated with the image of yourself, and therefore corresponds to what you mean by I. Whereas in fact, I is like EYE. It's an aperture through which the universe is examining itself. And it is always basically unconscious of itself, for the same reason that you can't bite your own teeth or kiss your own lips. The universe really, just as the edge of a sword doesn't cut the edge of a sword, the universe doesn't need to know itself, that is to say, make itself an object. Because when you make anything an object, it becomes objectionable. This is a very curious aspect of modern history, that the 19th century, 18th century mythology, which we call scientific naturalism, made a great point of taking an objective attitude to everything. Finally, taking an objective attitude to the human mind, as in B.F. Skinner. See? The mind is an object. And thus there is no subject left. Well, then everything becomes objectionable, and we invent the hydrogen bomb to blow it all up. Suicide is the end of a purely objective world.
So do you feel it now, that silence? Or can you admit to it?
Oh, yes. It's a constant undercurrent.
Can one have seen this or felt the silence and then still have the babble go on?
Yes.
So one doesn't have to have a total silence to have.
No. If you can't meditate in a boiler factory, you can't meditate.
But what if the boiler factory is inside your skull? I mean,
Even so. It's like space behind the stars. You can't have any stars without space. And so there is always in the background of whatever goes on in my head, let's supposing I'm absolutely scared stiff, that I've got cancer or the Great Siberian Itch. Nevertheless, far, far in the back of my mind, there is an incredible serenity of eternal silence. But it isn't nothing, it isn't negative in the ordinary way in which Western people think of it. We don't understand in the West that you can't have something without nothing. Nothing is tremendously important. It's the mother. It's the womb of the universe. And it's space. It's, as St. Thomas Aquinas put it, the silent pause which gives sweetness to the chant.
Did that serene space you're in touch with, did you achieve that serenity through anything that you've done in your life?
One doesn't achieve it, you see. That is sort of asking the wrong question. There's a famous story about an American visiting England who wanted to find the village of Upper Tuddenham. And he asked a yokel, "What's a way to Upper Tuddenham? Do you know where it is?" And he scratched his head and said, "Well, sir, I know where it is, but if I were you, I wouldn't start from here." And so in the same way, one doesn't quite speak of achieving it, because you have to understand first that there is no separate you to achieve it.
So it doesn't matter what one does.
What one does is mostly empty motions. And when you understand that, however, and look, this is the point that people need to understand. When you understand that, you can act creatively, because you act with the whole energy of the universe behind you.
How do you respond when someone says to you, well, you say that there is this total serene space which underlines everything, but that's merely intellectual knowledge. People are saying that all the time.
But it isn't intellectual knowledge. I mean, you can't put it into words. Intellectual knowledge is what you can put into words. This is a feeling. It's one might almost say a concrete sensation.
Why is it talked of as insight then in the Prajnaparamita, if it's a feeling?
Because well, insight is an English word.
Prajna then.
Prajna means intuitive wisdom. The fundamental sense of life. Now, we can't talk about it because it's ineffable. That means, in Greek, what cannot be spoken, in the same way as mysticism comes from the Greek verb muin, mu, which is the finger on the lips, or as we say, mum's the word. There's something that can't be told, and that's what's important.
Mu.
Mu.
Now, it's amazing what doesn't exist in the real world. For example, in the real world, there aren't any things, nor are there any events. That doesn't mean to say that the real world is a perfectly featureless blank. It means that it is a marvelous system of wiggles in which we descry things and events in the same way as we would project images on a Rorschach blot, or pick out particular groups of stars in the sky and call them constellations, as if they were separate groups of stars. Well, they're groups of stars in the mind's eye, in our system of concepts. They are not out there as constellations already grouped in the sky. So in the same way, the difference between myself and all the rest of the universe is nothing more than an idea. It is not a real difference. And meditation is the way in which we come to feel our basic inseparability from the whole universe. And what that requires is that we shut up. That is to say, that we become interiorly silent and cease from the interminable chatter that goes on inside our skulls. Because you see, most of us think compulsively all the time. That is to say, we talk to ourselves. And I remember when I was a boy, we had a common saying, talking to yourself is the first sign of madness. Now, obviously, if I talk all the time, I don't hear what anyone else has to say. And so in exactly the same way, if I think all the time, that is to say, if I talk to myself all the time, I don't have anything to think about except thoughts. And therefore I'm living entirely in the world of symbols, and I'm never in relationship with reality. All right, now that's the first basic reason for meditation. But there is another sense, and this is going to be a little bit more difficult to understand, why we could say that meditation doesn't have a reason or doesn't have a purpose. And in this respect, it's unlike almost all other things that we do, except perhaps making music and dancing. Because when we make music, we don't do it in order to reach a certain point, such as the end of the composition. If that were the purpose of music, to get to the end of the piece, then obviously the fastest players would be the best. And so likewise, when we are dancing, we are not aiming to arrive at a particular place on the floor, as we would be if we were taking a journey. When we dance, the journey itself is the point. When we play music, the playing itself is the point. And exactly the same thing is true in meditation. Meditation is the discovery that the point of life is always arrived at in the immediate moment. And therefore, if you meditate for an ulterior motive, that is to say, to improve your mind, to improve your character, to be more efficient in life, you've got your eye on the future and you are not meditating. Because the future is a concept. It doesn't exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now. And that's one of the things we discover when we stop talking to ourselves and stop thinking. We find there is only a present, only an eternal now. So it's funny then, isn't it, that one meditates for no reason at all, except we could say for the enjoyment of it. And here I would interpose the essential principle that meditation is supposed to be fun. It's not something you do as a grim duty. The trouble with religion, as we know it, is that it is so mixed up with grim duties. We do it because it's good for you. It's a kind of self-punishment. Well, meditation, when correctly done, has nothing to do with all that. It's a kind of digging the present. It's a kind of grooving with the eternal now. And brings us into a state of peace where we can understand that the point of life, the place where it's at, is simply here and now. The easiest way to get into the meditative state is to begin by listening. If you simply close your eyes and allow yourself to hear all the sounds that are going on around you, just listen to the general hum and buzz of the world as if you were listening to music. Don't try to identify the sounds you're hearing. Don't put names on them. Simply allow them to play with your eardrums. And let them go. In other words, you could put it, let your ears hear whatever they want to hear. Don't judge the sounds. There are no, as it were, proper sounds or improper sounds, and it doesn't matter if somebody coughs or sneezes or drops something. It's all just sound. And if I am talking to you right now and you're doing this, I want you to listen to the sound of my voice just as if it were noise. Don't try to make any sense out of what I'm saying, because your brain will take care of that automatically. You don't have to try to understand anything. Just listen to the sound. As you pursue that experiment, you will very naturally find that you can't help naming sounds, identifying them, that you will go on thinking, that is to say, talking to yourself inside your head automatically. But it's important that you don't try to repress those thoughts by forcing them out of your mind, because that will have precisely the same effect as if you were trying to smooth rough water with a flat iron. You're just going to disturb it all the more. What you do is this. As you hear sounds coming up in your head, thoughts, you simply listen to them as part of the general noise going on, just as you would be listening to the sound of my voice, or just as you would be listening to cars going by or to birds chattering outside the window. So look at your own thoughts as just noises. And soon you will find that the so-called outside world and the so-called inside world come together. They are a happening. Your thoughts are a happening, just like the sounds going on outside. And everything is simply a happening, and all you're doing is watching it. Now, in this process, another thing that is happening that is very important is that you're breathing. And as you start meditation, you allow your breath to run just as it wills. In other words, don't do at first any breathing exercise, but just watch your breath breathing the way it wants to breathe. And notice a curious thing about this. You say in the ordinary way, I breathe, because you feel that breathing is something that you are doing voluntarily, just in the same way as you might be walking or talking. But you will also notice that when you are not thinking about breathing, your breathing goes on just the same. So the curious thing about breath is that it can be looked at both as a voluntary and an involuntary action. You can feel on the one hand, I am doing it, and on the other hand, it is happening to me. And that is why breathing is a most important part of meditation, because it is going to show you, as you become aware of your breath, that the hard and fast division that we make between what we do on the one hand and what happens to us on the other is arbitrary. So that as you watch your breathing, you will become aware that both the voluntary and the involuntary aspects of your experience are all one happening. Now that may at first seem a little scary, because you may think, well, am I just the puppet of a happening, the mere passive witness of something that's going on completely beyond my control? Or on the other hand, am I really doing everything that's going along? Well, if I were, I should be God. And that would be very embarrassing, because I would be in charge of everything. That would be a terribly responsible position. The truth of the matter, as you will see it, is that both things are true. You can see it that everything is happening to you, and on the other hand, you're doing everything. For example, it's your eyes that are turning the sun into light. It's the nerve ends in your skin that are turning electric vibrations in the air into heat and temperature. It's your eardrums that are turning vibrations in the air into sound, and in that way you are creating the world. But when we are not talking about it, when we are not philosophizing about it, then there is just this happening, this, and we won't give it a name. So then, let me connect this with the problem of birth and death, which puzzles people enormously, of course. Because in order to understand what the self is, you have to remember that it doesn't need to remember anything. Just like you don't need to know how you work your thyroid gland. So then, when you die, you're not going to have to put up with everlasting non-existence, because that's not an experience. A lot of people are afraid that when they die, they're going to be locked up in a dark room forever. And sort of undergo that. But one of the most interesting things in the world, this is a yoga, this is a way of realization. Try and imagine what it will be like to go to sleep and never wake up. Think about that. Children think about it. It's one of the great wonders of life. What will it be like to go to sleep and never wake up? And if you think long enough about that, something will happen to you. You will find out, among other things, that it'll pose the next question to you. What was it like to wake up after having never gone to sleep? That was when you were born. You see, you can't have an experience of nothing. Nature abhors a vacuum. So after you're dead, the only thing that can happen is the same experience, or the same sort of experience, as when you were born. In other words, we all know very well that after people die, other people are born. And they're all you. Only you can only experience it one at a time. Everybody is I. You all know you are you. And wheresoever beings exist throughout all galaxies, it doesn't make any difference. You are all of them. And when they come into being, that's you coming into being. You know that very well. Only you don't have to remember the past. In the same way, you don't have to think about how you work your thyroid gland or whatever else it is in your organism. You don't have to know how to shine the sun. You just do it. Like you breathe. Doesn't it really astonish you that you are this fantastically complex thing? And that you're doing all of this and you never had any education in how to do it? You never learned, but you're this miracle? Well, the point is that from a strictly physical, scientific standpoint, this organism is a continuous energy with everything else that's going on. And if I am my foot, I am the sun. Only we've got this little partial view. We've got the idea that no, I'm just something in this body. The ego. That's a joke. The ego is nothing other than the focus of conscious attention. It's like a radar on a ship. The radar on a ship is a troubleshooter. Is there anything in the way? And conscious attention is a designed function of the brain to scan the environment, like a radar does, and note for any trouble-making changes. But if you identify yourself with your troubleshooter, then naturally you define yourself as being in a perpetual state of anxiety. And the moment we cease to identify with the ego and become aware that we are the whole organism, you realize as the first thing how harmonious it all is. Because your organism is a miracle of harmony. All this thing functioning together. Even those corpuscles and creatures that are fighting each other in the bloodstream and eating each other up. If they weren't doing that, you wouldn't be healthy. So what is discord at one level of your being is harmony at a higher level. And you begin to realize that, and you begin to be aware too that the discords of your life and the discords of people's life, which are a fight at one level, at a higher level of the universe, are healthy and harmonious. And you suddenly realize that everything that you are and do is at that level as magnificent and as free of any blemish as the patterns in waves, the markings in marble, the way a cat moves, and that this world is really okay and can't be anything else, because otherwise it couldn't exist. But the reality underneath physical existence, or which really is physical existence, because in my philosophy there's no difference between the physical and the spiritual. These are absolutely out-of-date categories. It's all process. It isn't stuff on the one hand and form on the other. It is pattern. Life is pattern. It is a dance of energy. So I will never invoke spooky knowledge. That is to say that I've had a private revelation, or that I have sensory vibrations going on a plane which you don't have. Everything is standing right out in the open. And it's just a question of how you look at it. So you do discover, when you realize this, the most extraordinary thing to me that I never cease to be flabbergasted at whenever it happens to me.